They were never meant to be read, never meant to be heard. 4 files sealed in dust, buried beneath layers of redaction and diplomatic silence, resurfacing only now. Faded ink, blurred signatures, and stamped words that repeat the same chilling refrain. Top secret, eyes only. The Second World War left behind ruins, graves, and nations broken beyond repair. But beneath the ruins were darker truths, truths so dangerous they were never allowed into the official record. In the decades that followed, governments silenced survivors, destroyed evidence, and rewrote narratives to protect fragile alliances. Yet fragments escaped, the testimonies of villagers, the suppressed cables of field officers, the whispered recollections of soldiers who could never forget. What emerges from these fragments is not a story of victory, but of secrecy. The hidden experiments, the erased massacres, the forced betrayals, and the secret bargains that shaped the atomic age. Each is a scar carved into the shadows of history, where silence was bought at the price of justice. Tonight, these forbidden files are opened. Their contents are not comfortable, not patriotic, and not intended for the faint-hearted. These are the secrets of a war that never truly ended, the suppressed record of humanity's darkest hour. Chapter 1. The Forbidden Experiments of Unit 731. In the frozen winter of 1932, Japanese troops marched into Manchuria under the banner of the Kwantung Army, establishing a puppet state they named Manchukuo. Within its bleak landscape, a facility arose that would never appear on official maps, disguised behind the walls of a lumber mill near Pingfang, just outside Harbin. To the outside world, it was an innocuous industrial site. In truth, it became the most notorious human experimentation complex of the Second World War, designated by its codename, Unit 731. Over the following decade, thousands of civilians and prisoners of war vanished into its gates, never to re-emerge. Their records were not logged in military archives, their graves never marked. They were reduced to numbers, or more precisely, to logs, the cruel term used by their captors to describe them. The commandant of this secret empire of suffering was General Shiro Ishii, a brilliant microbiologist who had convinced Japan's military leadership that biological weapons could shift the balance of global warfare. He was granted unlimited resources, protected by the highest echelons of the Imperial Army. Ishii's facility developed its own farms, laboratories, incinerators, and prison blocks. Test subjects, drawn from Chinese villages, Korean communities, Russian captives, and Allied prisoners of war, were marched inside as disposable material for the Empire's secret war science. According to declassified fragments discovered in post-war years, no fewer than 3,000 people died within its walls, though unofficial estimates place the number far higher. Inside Unit 731, experiments unfolded with chilling precision. Frostbite tests were conducted by leaving captives' limbs exposed to sub-zero temperatures until flesh froze solid. Then attempting crude thawing methods, scalding water, open flames, even beating the frozen flesh with sticks. Survivors rarely lasted beyond a single test. Their bodies eventually dissected without anesthesia for anatomical study. Prisoners were locked in pressure chambers to determine the point at which human lungs ruptured. Others were tied to stakes on firing ranges to test the accuracy of new weapons, including flamethrowers and fragmentation bombs. Test chambers were filled with plague-infested fleas or aerosolized anthrax spores, released deliberately to measure infection spread. In nearby villages, entire populations were exposed in field trials, where food supplies and water sources were contaminated. The results were carefully logged, not as war crimes, but as valuable data. What makes Unit 731 uniquely horrifying is not only the cruelty, but the bureaucratic indifference that cloaked it. Prisoner intake was disguised under false medical records. Executions were logged as termination of experiment. Even the destruction of bodies was designed to leave no trace, with furnaces and acid vats consuming evidence. Yet not everything could be erased. Soviet forces who liberated parts of Manchuria in 1945 discovered intact chambers filled with instruments and cages, and local witnesses testified to the disappearance of entire families. What they uncovered suggested not isolated crimes, but an industrial-scale research program sanctioned at the highest levels. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, one might expect the commanders of Unit 731 to face justice. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal tried numerous Japanese leaders, but Ishii and his closest colleagues never sat in the dock. The reason lay in secret negotiations conducted under the authority of General Douglas MacArthur. US intelligence, recognizing the strategic value of the data gathered at Unit 731, offered immunity in exchange for full access to the research findings. In effect, evidence of human experimentation was reclassified not as proof of atrocities, but as military intelligence. The files were transported across the Pacific to Fort Detrick, Maryland, where they were quietly integrated into America's own biological warfare program. Soviet prosecutors attempted to expose the truth in their Khabarovsk trials of 1949, but Western governments dismissed these proceedings as propaganda, ensuring that the subject remained buried in silence. Declassified documents now reveal the depth of these arrangements. Memoranda from US Army intelligence confirmed that scientists were shielded from accountability to prevent Soviet acquisition of their knowledge. Among the preserved files are detailed charts of plague infection rates, frostbite endurance times, and dispersal techniques for cholera in water systems. For decades, these findings remained classified, accessible only to a handful of defense scientists. Survivors and victims' families were denied recognition, their testimonies ignored in post-war Japan, where even the existence of Unit 731 was denied until the 1980s. It was not until former guards began to speak out, haunted by their memories, that fragments of the truth entered public awareness. Eyewitness accounts described the smell of burning flesh from incinerators, the muffled cries of captives taken into surgical theaters, and the eerie silence that followed mass executions at dawn. One guard later confessed that he watched children injected with pathogens, their fevers charted until death, their bodies dissected in the name of science. The cruelty was systematic, not random, and carried out by men in white coats who justified their actions as patriotism. For them, war provided the ultimate cover for experimentation beyond morality. The silence surrounding Unit 731 lasted nearly half a century, because acknowledging it threatened the fragile post-war order. To admit its reality was to admit that Allied powers had colluded in shielding its perpetrators. Only in recent decades have archives confirmed that Ishii himself lived freely until his death in 1959, never prosecuted, never disgraced. Many of his staff went on to prominent academic or medical careers in post-war Japan. The knowledge extracted at the price of human suffering was woven into Cold War military planning, erased from history books but never from classified vaults. Today, when researchers trace the origins of biological warfare programs in both East and West, they encounter the shadow of Unit 731. Its lessons were not moral ones, but tactical: how to weaponize disease, how to measure human limits, how to erase entire populations without leaving visible ruins. The files were meant to remain buried forever, locked away under stamped seals of eyes only. Yet their existence, now undeniable, reveals that beneath the celebrated victories of 1945 lies a darker truth. War was not only fought on the battlefield, but in laboratories where the value of human life was reduced to a set of data points. And that data, purchased in silence, became the foundation for a hidden legacy that continues to haunt the modern age. Chapter 2: The Erased Massacre at Nemmersdorf. October 21st, 1944. A date that should have remained etched in the collective memory of Europe, but instead has been blurred by denial, propaganda, and deliberate erasure. On that day, the Red Army broke through German defenses in East Prussia, seizing the small farming village of Nemmersdorf near the Angarap River. For the German civilians who had not yet fled, the advance marked the arrival of unimaginable terror. Witnesses later described the sound of Soviet artillery pounding the countryside, followed by the shouts of soldiers entering homes, barns, and churches. Within hours, the village became a place of slaughter. Reports compiled by German officers who arrived after the Soviet withdrawal recorded scenes of deliberate cruelty. Women were found tied to wagons, their bodies mutilated. Children and the elderly had been executed in groups. Several villagers had been nailed to barn doors in acts of staged crucifixion. Horses were slaughtered in the streets, carts overturned, and belongings ransacked. Forensic pathologists, dispatched by the Wehrmacht, documented the evidence with photographs and signed statements. These files were marked with the chilling label Geheime Reichssache, top secret of the Reich. Even hardened officers admitted that the scenes surpassed anything they had encountered on the Eastern Front. The massacre at Nemmersdorf quickly became a propaganda weapon for the collapsing Nazi regime. Joseph Goebbels seized on the reports, spreading lurid accounts through German newsreels to harden civilian resistance. Posters and radio broadcasts declared that surrender to the Soviets meant annihilation. In the desperate final months of the war, these accounts fueled fanaticism, convincing thousands of civilians to fight to the death rather than fall into Soviet hands. Yet buried within this propaganda was a darker truth. Many of the testimonies were authentic and the atrocities were real, but their authenticity created a problem for the Allies after the war. By May 1945, the Soviet Union was no longer a wartime ally, but a looming adversary in the Cold War. Exposing Soviet war crimes threatened to fracture the fragile alliance that had secured victory in Europe. At the Nuremberg trials, German defense attorneys attempted to submit evidence from Nemmersdorf, including sworn testimony, medical reports, and photographs. The tribunal, however, dismissed the evidence as inadmissible, citing its use in Nazi propaganda. Allied prosecutors avoided raising the issue altogether, unwilling to legitimize anything that could tarnish the Soviet record. In effect, the massacre was erased not because it was false, but because it was inconvenient. Declassified Soviet archives, opened briefly in the 1990s, confirm that the NKVD received internal reports acknowledging civilian massacres in East Prussia. These reports, marked for Stalin's eyes only, described disciplinary incidents and excesses of retribution committed by Red Army soldiers after months of brutal fighting. Nemmersdorf was not an isolated case. It was part of a wider pattern of atrocities committed as Soviet troops advanced into enemy territory. Yet official Soviet histories describe their entry into Germany as one of liberation, never of bloodshed. Those contradictions remain buried under layers of nationalist mythology and Cold War censorship. The erasure of Nemmersdorf left survivors in silence. Those who had fled the village before the massacre were unable to return, as East Prussia was annexed by the Soviet Union and Poland after the war. Nemmersdorf itself was renamed Mayakovskoye, its German population expelled. The graves of the murdered were either destroyed or absorbed into the reshaped landscape. When former villagers tried to speak, they were branded as Nazi sympathizers or accused of spreading propaganda. Their memories, stripped of legitimacy, were confined to private letters and whispered family stories. Only decades later did fragments of their accounts resurface in exile communities in West Germany. Photographs smuggled out of archives depict bodies arranged in grotesque displays, some of which remain too disturbing to publish. Forensic reports describe injuries inconsistent with combat, supporting accounts of executions and ritualized violence. Yet each time researchers attempted to raise the subject, they faced resistance. In the 1960s, when German scholars pressed for recognition of the massacre, they were accused of revisionism. In the Soviet Union, discussion of atrocities committed by the Red Army was forbidden entirely, punishable as anti-Soviet agitation. Silence, once again, proved stronger than truth. In the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Russian military archives briefly released documents that mentioned Nemmersdorf in passing. These included casualty reports, court-martial records of soldiers charged with looting, and memoranda noting disciplinary issues. Yet the majority of the files remain sealed, and what has been made public is heavily redacted. Some historians argue that entire sets of photographs and testimonies were deliberately destroyed during the Khrushchev era to protect the image of the Red Army as liberators. Whether destroyed or still hidden, the absence of full records ensures that the massacre remains shrouded in partial truth. What makes Nemmersdorf especially haunting is its role as both a documented event and a symbol. To some, it stands as proof of Soviet brutality. To others, it is tainted by its use in Nazi propaganda, forever caught in a liminal state between history and manipulation. But to the survivors, the propaganda was irrelevant. They remembered the screams, the smell of blood, and the silence that followed. One survivor, interviewed in the 1980s, recalled seeing her neighbors' bodies lined against a wall, their faces mutilated. She was a child then, but her memory was precise. The soldiers spoke Russian, and they laughed as they carried out the killings. The erasure of Nemmersdorf was not only an act of censorship, but also a crime of memory. By suppressing the evidence, the post-war powers denied recognition to the dead. The massacre became a ghost, too inconvenient to acknowledge, too politically dangerous to expose. The world learned of Auschwitz and Hiroshima, but Nemmersdorf was forced into silence. It is a silence that still lingers, a reminder that history is not only what is remembered, but also what is deliberately forgotten. When we reopen this file, we confront not only the brutality of war, but the complicity of those who chose silence. Nemmersdorf reveals the cost of alliances forged in desperation and the price of truths buried for political convenience. The village may no longer exist under its name, its fields now ploughed by strangers, but its shadow persists. In the stillness of those fields lies the memory of a massacre that was erased from the official record, yet remains etched in the hidden conscience of history. Chapter 3: The Classified Secret of Operation Keelhaul. The Second World War officially ended in Europe on May 8, 1945, but for tens of thousands of people stranded in displaced persons camps across Austria, Germany and Italy, the war's end was only the beginning of another nightmare. These were not enemy soldiers in the conventional sense. Many were Soviet citizens who had been captured by the Germans and forced into slave labor. Others were Cossack fighters, White Army remnants from the Russian Civil War, and anti-communist partisans who had fled Bolshevik terror long before Hitler rose to power. Entire families followed them, wives, children, and elderly parents, seeking refuge from Stalin's iron grip. They believed that with the war's end, they would find sanctuary under the protection of the Allies. Instead, they became victims of a secret deal forged months earlier at the Yalta Conference. Under its terms, the Western Allies agreed to repatriate all Soviet citizens, regardless of their will. The secret codename for the operation was Keelhaul. The name itself, drawn from an old naval punishment in which sailors were dragged beneath the hull of a ship, was grimly appropriate. For the people trapped in the camps, repatriation meant certain death or imprisonment in Siberian gulags. Yet the agreement was considered a diplomatic necessity. Stalin demanded the return of all Soviet citizens, branding them as traitors for having surrendered or collaborated with the enemy. Roosevelt and Churchill, eager to secure Soviet cooperation in the final defeat of Japan and the post-war division of Europe, conceded. The terms were hidden from public view, buried in classified annexes of the Yalta Accords. To the world, the Allies appeared as liberators. To the men and women forced onto eastbound trains, they became executioners. Eyewitness accounts from British and American officers stationed at camps like Judenburg in Austria or Plattling in Bavaria describe harrowing scenes. Families, realizing their fate, clung to one another in desperation. Some attempted suicide rather than face repatriation. In one notorious episode near Lienz, Austria, Cossack leaders and their families, numbering in the thousands, were invited to what they believed was a routine meeting with British authorities. Instead, they were surrounded by armed guards, disarmed, and handed over to waiting Soviet NKVD units. Many were executed within days. Others were crammed into cattle cars, bound for Siberia. Soldiers who participated in these forced transfers later wrote that the cries of children and the pleading of parents haunted them for the rest of their lives. Officially, the operation was framed as a logistical necessity, a matter of returning displaced persons to their countries of origin. But the documents now available reveal that Allied leaders were fully aware of the consequences. Memoranda from British Foreign Office officials explicitly warned that repatriated individuals would face execution or forced labor. American officers filed similar reports, pleading for exceptions to be made. Yet their appeals were ignored. In a declassified cable from June 1945, General Eisenhower himself acknowledged the grim fate awaiting many of the returnees, but emphasized that political commitments required strict adherence to the agreement. The file was marked for eyes of senior command only. The mechanics of Operation Keelhaul were methodical. Allied soldiers were given strict orders: prevent escape, suppress resistance, and deliver prisoners directly to Soviet custody. In some cases, soldiers used deception, telling families they were being relocated to better camps, only to deliver them to Soviet officers at border crossings. At other times, violence erupted as desperate prisoners resisted. Accounts from the Austrian border describe people throwing themselves into rivers to avoid capture, mothers smothering their own children to spare them from deportation, and entire groups attempting mass suicide. The brutality was not always inflicted by Soviet troops. Often, it was Allied hands that pushed the unwilling onto trains, following orders they despised. The secrecy surrounding Operation Keelhaul was nearly absolute. Few photographs were taken, and most official records were classified for decades. Survivors who escaped spoke of betrayal, but their voices were marginalized, dismissed as Cold War exaggerations. It was not until the 1970s, when historians gained access to partially declassified files, that the scale of the operation began to surface. Even then, the revelations were controversial. Western governments were reluctant to acknowledge that their soldiers had participated in what was, in effect, a mass deportation to death camps. The narrative of the good war, fought for freedom and liberation, left no room for this stain. The moral ambiguity of Operation Keelhaul extends beyond the immediate victims. Allied soldiers trained to see themselves as liberators were traumatized by their role. Letters and diaries reveal deep conflict. One British officer wrote that he felt he had betrayed every principle he had fought for. An American sergeant recorded that he watched families dragged into hell while he stood powerless, bound by orders. Many veterans carried this guilt silently, unable to speak publicly about their role for fear of dishonor. The silence they endured mirrored the silence imposed on the victims. Historians now estimate that between 2 and 3 million people were repatriated under Operation Keelhaul and related agreements. Not all were executed, but the vast majority faced imprisonment in gulags, forced labor camps, or exile to remote regions. For many, survival meant decades of suffering under brutal conditions, their identities erased from official records. The Cossack communities, once vibrant in Eastern Europe, were shattered. Anti-communist partisans, who had fought not for Hitler but for survival, vanished into the maw of Stalin's system. Families were torn apart, their lineage broken by political betrayal. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Keelhaul is the conscious decision to conceal it. Unlike battlefield atrocities, which could be attributed to chaos, this was an organized, bureaucratic operation. Decisions were made in conference rooms, sealed with signatures, and executed with precision. The moral compromise was deliberate. Human lives were weighed against geopolitical necessity, and the latter prevailed. This secrecy ensured that, for decades, the victims remained nameless shadows in history. Only fragments of their fate emerged in émigré communities, where survivors whispered of betrayal, but found little audience in the West. When the Cold War intensified, Operation Keelhaul became even more taboo. To acknowledge it would have been to admit complicity in Stalin's terror. Instead, governments chose silence. Archives remained closed, files destroyed or heavily censored. Even in the 1990s, when glasnost opened portions of Soviet history, the subject remained sensitive in Western capitals. The betrayal of these people was not just an episode of wartime tragedy, but a permanent scar on the conscience of nations that proclaimed themselves defenders of liberty. Today, the story of Operation Keelhaul forces us to confront the hidden costs of victory. It reminds us that behind every treaty and alliance lies a ledger of compromises, where ideals are often sacrificed to expedience. The victims of Keelhaul did not fall on battlefields. They were handed over by those they believed were saviors. Their fate was sealed not by the chaos of war, but by the deliberate decisions of leaders. Their silence, imposed by secrecy, remains a haunting echo of the forbidden history buried beneath the triumphal narrative of 1945. And though decades have passed, the ghosts of those trains still travel eastward in memory, bound for a destiny written not by their enemies, but by their supposed allies. Chapter 4: Hidden Nuclear Bargains of Operation Alsos. By the spring of 1945, as the Reich crumbled and Allied forces carved their way through the ruins of Hitler's empire, a quieter war was being waged in the shadows. It was not a battle fought with tanks or artillery, but with documents, blueprints, and the minds of men who carried within them the possibility of a new world order. This was the secret race for the remnants of Germany's nuclear program, conducted under the codename Operation Alsos. On the surface, Alsos appeared to be a straightforward mission: track down and neutralize Germany's atomic research. But behind the official reports lay hidden bargains, covert raids, and an intelligence war between allies whose trust had already begun to fracture. The nuclear files of Nazi Germany became currency in the emerging Cold War, and the men who held them were treated not as criminals, but as prizes to be divided. Operation Alsos was formally launched in 1943 under the leadership of Colonel Boris Pasch, a former military intelligence officer, and Samuel Goudsmit, a Dutch-American physicist. Their orders, issued by the Manhattan Project's command structure, were clear: determine how far the Germans had progressed toward an atomic bomb, capture their facilities, and secure their scientists before they could fall into enemy hands. The stakes were existential. If Hitler's regime had achieved even partial success in uranium enrichment or reactor design, the war could have taken a catastrophic turn. By 1944, Intelligence suggested that the Germans were experimenting with heavy water reactors in Norway, uranium separation in laboratories across Berlin, and theoretical physics projects involving men like Werner Heisenberg, Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, and Kurt Diebner. The ALSO's teams, attached to advancing Allied divisions, followed the trail of fragments, piecing together the scattered remnants of the Reich's secret science. As American and British forces pushed into Western Germany, ALSO's units moved swiftly to seize laboratories in Strasbourg, Haigerloch, and Hechingen. At Haigerloch, deep beneath a medieval church, they discovered a partially assembled experimental reactor, suspended in a concrete pit and filled with uranium cubes encased in paraffin. The discovery proved that Germany had been far behind the Manhattan Project, but the implications were still alarming. If given time, the Reich might have achieved a working reactor capable of producing plutonium. More important than the equipment, however, were the scientists. Heisenberg, von Weizsäcker, and others were taken into custody during Operation Epsilon, confined to a villa in England, and monitored as part of a classified program known as the Farm Hall Transcripts. Their conversations, secretly recorded, revealed shock at the news of Hiroshima, proof that Germany had never come close to building a bomb. Yet the transcripts also revealed something darker. These men were not tried as war criminals. They were protected assets in a secret bargain. What remains hidden in the declassified fragments is the depth of the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union over these spoils. Even before Germany's surrender, Soviet operatives had launched parallel missions, racing to capture laboratories and scientists in the eastern zones. Reports from the NKVD detail night raids in Thuringia and Saxony, where Soviet troops seized uranium stockpiles and transported physicists to Moscow. American files reveal similar raids, conducted under the cover of advancing divisions, sometimes hours before Soviet forces arrived. One report from April 1945 describes a midnight convoy spiriting away crates of uranium oxide from a mine in Stassfurt, just days before the Red Army would have taken control. These seizures were never acknowledged publicly. They were buried in classified annexes marked Atomic Files Restricted. The hidden bargains went deeper than seizures. Testimonies from captured scientists suggest that negotiations were made at the highest levels, ensuring that certain German physicists were quietly divided between East and West. Some, like Manfred von Ardenne, were relocated to the Soviet Union, where they became instrumental in Stalin's atomic program. Others, including experts in metallurgy and reactor design, were transported under false identities to the United States. Officially, Operation Paperclip dealt with rocket scientists like Werner von Braun, but unofficial extensions dealt with nuclear expertise. These transfers were sanitized in the archives, stripped of names and disguised as technical personnel relocations. Yet decades later, fragments confirm that both powers deliberately suppressed the scale of Germany's nuclear advances to prevent public panic and political fallout. The ALSO's files also reveal a chilling directive. Evidence of Germany's near success in uranium enrichment was to be concealed from public discourse. Reports describing partially enriched uranium samples and advanced theoretical calculations were marked as not to be disseminated outside authorized channels. The reasoning was twofold. First, to prevent enemy nations from exploiting the information. Second, to maintain the narrative that the atomic bomb was solely the product of Allied genius, untainted by the science of the enemy. In truth, the lines were blurred. German advances in heavy water production, reactor design, and isotope separation provided valuable insights to both American and Soviet programs. These insights were paid for not in trials and justice, but in silence and protection. The fate of the German scientists underscores the moral compromise at the heart of ALSOS. Men who had worked, however reluctantly, under the Nazi regime were not prosecuted but rewarded. At Farm Hall, their conversations revealed no remorse for serving Hitler, only disappointment at their failure to complete their projects. Yet rather than face judgment, they were reintegrated into the scientific communities of their captors. In the Soviet Union, this meant secret research institutes near Moscow. In the United States, it meant quiet contracts with military laboratories. Their wartime affiliations were erased, replaced with new identities as Cold War assets. Justice was sacrificed to strategic necessity. Perhaps most disturbing is the suggestion, hinted at in heavily redacted documents, that an unspoken exchange occurred between the United States and the Soviet Union regarding certain scientists and materials. These were not formal agreements but tacit understandings, communicated through back channels to divide the spoils without igniting direct confrontation. Some files reference denied transfers and mutual accommodations, coded language that suggests a recognition of spheres of influence even before the Iron Curtain had officially fallen. If true, it means the Cold War began not in speeches or treaties, but in the silent exchange of men and knowledge stolen from the ruins of the Reich. The legacy of Operation Alsos is not only the confirmation that Germany never possessed an atomic bomb, but the revelation of how its remnants shaped the world that followed. The nuclear arms race of the Cold War, the balance of terror sustained by mutual assured destruction, and the proliferation of atomic science all bear the imprint of these hidden bargains. By concealing the full extent of Germany's progress, the Allies maintained a narrative of triumph. But in reality, they had absorbed fragments of a defeated enemy's science into their own arsenals. The line between victor and vanquished blurred in the glow of uranium. Today, the Haigerloch reactor pit is preserved as a museum, a silent monument to Germany's failed atomic ambitions. Visitors walk among the reconstructed uranium cubes, unaware that in classified vaults across Washington and Moscow, the real story remains sealed. The Alsos files remind us that victory in 1945 was not only measured in surrender documents and parades, but in secrets captured and bargains made. They remind us that history is not written solely in open records, but also in the classified pages locked away, stamped with the warning not to be released to the public. In those hidden files lies the truth that the atomic age was born not from one nation's genius, but from a shadow war over the remnants of another's defeat. That truth remains too dangerous even now to be fully told. The war ended, but the silence did not. In the decades that followed, families searched for answers, soldiers carried unspoken guilt, and entire nations rewrote their histories to bury what could never be admitted. From the frozen laboratories of Unit 731 to the ruined barns of Nemmersdorf, from the cattle cars of Operation Keelhaul to the uranium mines of Operation Alsos, the forbidden files of the Second World War reveal not triumph, but compromise. Each fragment we have recovered tells us that victory came at a price, paid in silence and secrecy, with the lives of the forgotten. Governments swore that the truth was too dangerous for the public, too corrosive for alliances, too destabilizing for the fragile peace that followed. And so, generation after generation, the records remained sealed, the testimonies dismissed, the evidence destroyed. But silence does not erase memory. Shadows remain where light was forbidden. As these long-buried files emerge, they remind us that history is never as clean as it is written, and that beneath every monument and treaty lies an archive of ghosts, waiting for their voices to be heard. The question is not whether these secrets exist, but how many more still remain hidden.